All right, everyone, welcome back to the God Attachment Healing Podcast. So excited to have you guys here today. As you guys have seen in the last couple of weeks, just kind of doing a lot of interviews and meeting new people, hearing about their stories about how they have found God, attached to God, have experienced different types of church hurt. And today, taking a little bit even deeper approach as we learn about Dr. Lisa Stanton's story in her relationship with God and where she was. So the topic for today is God attachment, mental health, and atheism. So we're going to try to cover all those topics as much as possible. And I just want to thank you for tuning in. As always, please subscribe, share this episode with your friends, and thank you again for supporting the podcast. And now we will jump to Dr. Lisa Stanton. Lisa, I know you mentioned in our email exchange to call you Lisa, and I started thinking about this because this was instilled in me as a child, that with anyone who has received a degree, you refer to them as Dr. Lisa Stanton or Dr. whatever their name would be, right? So I went into college, went into my master's program, and once I graduated, all my professors said, "You can call me by my first name now." And I said, "No, I can't. You don't understand. I will never be able to make that transition." So in our interview today, most likely I'll call you Dr. Lisa Stanton. If I get comfortable, you probably got me down to Lisa, so we'll be good.
Beautiful. So it's a measure of how comfortable I make you, whether you've transitioned.
I'm guessing that's what it is. So, but maybe it's just saying the whole thing. Maybe I'll go to Dr. Lisa. That might short it up a little bit.
I
We'll
have some
see.
friends who call me that just like as a joke, sort of. Like I'll come to dinner and they're like, "Oh, Dr. Lisa's here." I'm like, "Hi, guys. Thank you."
Right. So I'm looking forward to it as well. I'm working on my dissertation right now, hopefully be done by the end of summer. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same joke. So we'll see how that goes. But again, just thank you so much for being here. And yeah, if you could just share a little bit with the audience about who you are, what you do, and anything interesting that you'd like to share about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm Lisa, or Dr. Lisa Stanton. And just to like current day today, I live about 20 minutes west of Minneapolis with my husband on 10 acres. So we're like out of the city these days. We kind of went like city suburbs, and now we're like, I don't think we're going to go further than this, but but out in the country a little bit. So going back though, I guess like as far as education wise, I am from Pennsylvania. I went to college in Virginia and then got a PhD from University of Minnesota in social psychology. My area of expertise is weight change, so behavior change, especially body weight, and sort of associated chronic diseases. I then did a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern School of Medicine, which is in downtown Chicago. The campus is in Evanston, like the main stuff, but the medical school is downtown. So I was downtown Chicago working on projects related to behavioral cancer prevention and control. So essentially, if you think of like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, mostly, they actually have like a 40% risk of like the risk isn't biological, 40% of it is behavioral stuff.
Wow.
So I was looking at basically studies on helping those people do behavior change stuff that leads them to keep their cancer in remission. So mostly secondary prevention is what we call that. And then from there, spent a couple of years at a tech company doing similar things with diabetes. And then spent 2 years full-time writing my book that just came out and doing a lot of stuff that is like much more in this like God direction, because I had a big conversion that we'll come back to in the middle of that. And then right before we got on here, I was telling you most recently, God has called me back to the clinical research space, and I don't know why yet, but I know that I'm here. So I'm back working as a clinical researcher in the diabetes space again. But it's cool because it's still like helping people. And it's so interesting because I now see so much more of the behaviors that like of these people that now it's my like professional job to work with. And it's not my professional job to diagnose their spiritual maladies. But just because of my own struggles, I like know how much of it is related to spiritual stuff. So it's a really interesting
So true.
kind
Yeah.
of to look at, and not every single person, but like most people, if you've overeaten to the point that you have type 2 diabetes, you usually struggle with some type of eating disorder, some type of binge eating thing. And a lot of those really are more spiritual in nature. Off the record, those are more spiritual in nature. On the record, that's not what I study when I'm at work.
Hmm.
But it's just interesting to see where these worlds are sort of colliding for me these days.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, is there a personal connection to the field of diabetes? When you mentioned that, I know a number of people who have it. So I was
Mhm.
thinking about what that connection was for you.
I think it came out of just, I think the original personal connection was, I don't remember how much I got into it in the like version of my story I posted on Instagram, but eating disorders are a huge part of my story. And it
Mm,
was originally anorexia, but then eventually binge eating disorder. And then that transitioned to bulimia, which is essentially just binge eating disorder. You throw it up afterward.
mm,
Um, and so I feel oddly connected to people who end up with type 2 diabetes because I think a lot of them are suffering from those similar things or at least headed
mm,
toward those similar things. You know, it's on a spectrum, so at different levels. But like overeating and not knowing why, right? And then I was just throwing up afterwards. So people noticed more that something was wrong. But a lot of people are overeating and not knowing why and not getting to those clinical levels of diagnoses, but then like ending up, let's say, with a type 2 diabetes diagnoses.
mm.
Out of that. So I think there was a little personal connection with that. And then my little brother is only 25.
Mhm,
I know exactly how old he is.
mhm.
November 19th, 1999 is his birthday.
Okay.
Um, but
Yeah.
he also has pretty like severe unmanaged type 2 diabetes, and he suffers from
Mm,
a bunch of other mental health stuff that makes it really hard for him to manage.
yeah.
Um, so kind of a variety of connections to the diabetes space.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of layers there that yeah, that just kind of overlap with each other. There's the belief, there's the medical piece, and there's the mental health piece, right? And that's
Mhm.
essentially what we'll be talking about today, kind of this whole layered belief system of how one thing can affect another thing.
Mhm.
One of the things one of the reasons why I started this podcast was that there was people who started to deconstruct, and a big part of that had to do with their experiences within the church. And
Mhm.
one of the things that comes up oftentimes in church, at least for me growing up, was this negative view of going to counseling, right? The stigma attached to going to counseling for whatever reason, right? If you're depressed, the word of God should be enough. Why are you going to counseling, anxiety, and so on? And I'm assuming it was the same thing probably around eating disorders and other types of mental health issues. So a lot of people didn't feel like they felt distant from God or like they were doing something wrong for going to seek mental health services. And I'm curious for you, did you grow up in the church? And if you did, was that kind of the messaging that you heard, or was it different?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up very confused, I think
Mm,
is the only way to explain it. So my parents got divorced when I was 4. My
mm,
mom listens to every podcast and she always corrects me because I have it wrong, but it's somewhere between 3 and 5. They
mm.
got divorced.
Okay.
Um, and so my mom like doesn't believe in God, even didn't then, doesn't now.
Mm,
And my dad has had a lot of like changes over time. So when I was really little, he was Christian and we went to Christian churches, but jumped around a lot. We were Episcopalian, I think, when I was really young, and then we went to some other things for a while, and then we're Presbyterian when I was older.
mm,
So mostly just various Protestant denominations. But I mostly was just confused, I think, more than anything, because we kept switching and I didn't really know why. And then my mom, of course, doesn't believe in God. So then, like, the adults
mm,
in my life are not agreeing on things. So I don't really think that I could tell you about any specific, like, I don't even know if I really had a negative perception of God when I was little. It was just like I remember believing in God when I was really little. And then by the time I was 11 or so, I just sort of was like, dumb people believe in God. Like, this is stupid. I
mm,
don't know why anyone's doing this. So I don't know that I ever ended up like having to absorb any stigmas because I just didn't, which is so ironic that I was about to be like, I just didn't respect anyone with faith. So why would I respect their opinion?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but like that's pretty much, which is so ironic given where I am now, of course.
Sure.
But that's I think what where I went with it. But then I kind of the second part of that question was like, about counseling. I think both then and now. So then, um, I went to bajillions of counselors all the time because no one had any negative perception of them at all. But I think in some ways, thinking that that was a panacea is problematic on the other side, right? So there's the like, don't go at all, you should just read your Bible and figure it out, which of course is not particularly effective. But then there's also the like, there is nothing for you in the Bible, just go to more psychology and that will help you. And that's also not really very effective in the end. And obviously, like in the end, I've fallen somewhere in the middle of that, which is that like it takes I guess part of me now, sometimes online people are like, she doesn't like psychology and she's a psychologist. Um,
Right.
but I think there's places where the wrong psychologist can take people really in the wrong direction. And I think a lot of stuff for me with that happens, especially like when I think about my mental health struggles, whether it's eating disorders, addiction, depression, anxiety, that like one of the biggest places where like I think spiritual directors and psychologists sometimes disagree is around forgiveness. And I think that's a pretty big and important argument. Where
How so?
a good, at least in my experience, like a
Yeah.
good, actually, right before we popped on this, I was responding to someone who was writing to me about something about forgiveness, and their therapist, they were like, my therapist told me that I should forgive but never forget. And it was in response to a video that I had posted basically about like despair coming from unforgiveness.
Yeah.
And so I think with it, of course, like I'm saying good spiritual director, because as we know, there's a lot of like religious teachers who aren't good. But like a good spiritual director, not someone who's trying to like scare you or shame you or whatever,
Hmm.
like will like softly, I guess. I don't even know if I'm always soft, so maybe I'm not always a good spiritual director, but will softly push you toward realizing that unconditional forgiveness is actually the way of healing. And I think a lot of times therapists are looking to provide you relief from shame,
Mm.
and sometimes leave us with anger in trying to like relieve the shame first, or like prioritizing relief of the shame over relief of the unforgiveness.
Yeah.
Sometimes in therapy, they'll say, like, it's not your fault at all. Like, don't worry about it. Like, you're allowed to be mad at them. Those are all normal emotions, right? Because they're trying to like relieve any shame the person has. But in doing so, sometimes the healing of forgiveness can get
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. As when you brought up that discrepancy between how Christian counselors or directors, spiritual directors might view forgiveness and those in secular settings, I mean, immediately the thing that I thought of was that justification or that release of what what role did I play in this? There's usually shame around that. Like I can't accept the thing that I was responsible for. And
Mhm.
they think that if you do accept that, because I feel bad, then it must be bad. But no, that's
Mhm.
the whole part of, as you're mentioning, the healing process to feel that and then to process that and work through that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is definitely this area of forgiveness that there is a marked difference between how Christians may understand that and how non-Christians may see that. And we have the
Yeah.
gospel, so that kind of informs the way that we view forgiveness as well. So I
Yeah.
think that's a factor there.
I have one other thing that I thought of when you were saying that too, is just like I just really want to like put a pin in that thing that you just said, because I was more talking about forgiveness, but you brought up a really great point. Another big difference is like responsibility, that a lot of times therapists are trying to help you feel better, and sometimes like are diagnosing others rather than you in some ways. Like I think I see a
Mm,
lot of like people going to therapy and then like realizing that someone else is a narcissist or someone else hurt them in this way, or they shouldn't be in this type of thing. And there's sometimes less, again, not all therapists, but sometimes less of a focus on like, well, what did I do that put me in a relation? Let's say he is a
right.
narcissist. What did I do, or what is true attachment, right? What is in me that led me to decide that I wanted to be the other half of that relationship?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, like a good spiritual director is better at being like, their sin is their sin. let's figure out yours. Like, let's look at where your patterns are. Leave their patterns to them. Let's look at where your patterns are to see why you ended up here.
Yes, yes. It seems that the focus of counseling has been to make you feel better, not necessarily to heal. And healing is it's a term that is ongoing, right? Because do you really ever heal? I'm curious to hear what you think about that as we have our discussion. It's that healing is a process, it's ongoing, but are there ways in which you cope that are a lot better than you did before? And maybe that's part of it too. Um, but I know part of your story, Lisa. Comfortable now. Part of your story was about dealing with this the mental health struggles growing up, and yeah, tell us a little bit about that. Like, what were the mental health issues maybe that was really pressing on you? Because it sounds like it happened pretty early in life, and that's hard for a teenager, adolescent, even young adult to navigate without guidance or without those strong attachment figures in your life. So, what was that like for you, struggling with that?
Yeah. It was it was a lot and it was early and it was not always um like well, I didn't really understand what was going on for a really long time. So like long before even like I would say addiction comes in kind of like 14 plus and then becomes the star of the show, at least to the people around me who are now worried about me. But prior to that, starting really young, I didn't even honestly think of this as a thing until years later. I was in a psychology class and I was like, oh my gosh,
Mm,
that was a phobia. When I was in starting in preschool, I had a sticker phobia. And like
mm,
that may sound like, oh, that's cute and funny, but it was like my teachers knew not to put them around me. If there was a paid thank you sticker like in the 90s on the milk, I like could not put milk on my cereal that week. Like I was terrified
really?
of stickers.
Hmm.
Like if there was one on the ground around me, I would have to walk around it. My stepsister loved them and put them on her bed, and I would get like nauseous just going into her room because there was like stickers on her bed.
Mm,
So it was like off, right? It's not just
yeah.
like that much. It's like something is wrong. And the way that I view that now is it's one of the earliest signs of just like other things were wrong, but this is where my brain went to just like, this is the problem. Stickers are the problem. Nothing else is the problem. Um,
Mm.
and then basically the sticker phobia kind of went away. I honestly still don't love them today. Still
Okay.
ongoing healing. Like if you were like, would you rather more or fewer stickers in your life? Fewer is the answer.
Right.
But I'm not like I can like have an apple with a sticker on it and take the sticker off and proceed to eat the apple, which was like not possible when I was a child. Um, but it evolved from that to OCD with like light switches, primarily, or just like weird tapping things. And like that was the compulsion, and the obsession was that my mom was going to die, which had to do with some other like trauma and deaths, especially of mothers, that was happening in my life around that time.
Mhm.
So I like truly believe that if I didn't flick this light switch enough times, like my mother was at risk of dying as a result of that.
Mm.
And then in combination with that, had separation anxiety disorder, which is this thing where you have basically like nightmares that an attachment figure is going to die when you're separated from them,
Mhm.
which also was my mom.
Yeah. And how old
Um,
were you during that time?
this was like around like 8 to 11 or 12.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
And what had happened around that time when I was in fifth grade, which I think is like 10. So
Hmm.
prior to that, like a girl whose mom, we were going to adopt this girl whose mom was had cancer, and then her mom passed away. So like that mom died, and then my like mom, my now stepdad's ex-wife. So they were already divorced by this time, but she died like right around the same time. And then when I was in fifth grade, the mom of one of my classmates was obviously having mental health issues and murdered him and committed suicide. So
Mm.
moms were just like behaving in confusing ways is probably the best way to explain it.
Yeah.
So I think that's why like that started to develop. And then basically, I think like those things kind of petered out, and I don't really remember anything, like mostly just anxiety after that when I was like 11 to 13. And then freshman year into sophomore year of high school, kind of simultaneously, I started drinking a lot. Like from the day I started drinking, I was like blackout drinking a
Mm.
lot all the time. Like I was drinking at school with older kids. I started dating a senior in high school who had access to alcohol.
Mm.
So it happened pretty quickly. And then simultaneously, the eating disorder started. So those got really bad or like started the summer after freshman year of high school. So between July of that year and December of that year, I went from 115 pounds, I was already skinny,
Mhm.
to like 88.
Wow. Yeah.
So it just went to like, and then obviously that's when like alarm bells started sounding because I looked like a skeleton. Um,
Hmm.
and so then I like, that's when kind of therapy started for that. And I had been on and off in therapy for all those other things, but I would just kind of say it was okay because therapy when you're 8 is scary.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so it was more just like, I don't know. So that whole like ocean of OCD and the sticker phobia kind of went away when like from that time on, my like thought life was obsessed by food and alcohol,
Yeah.
like one or the other or both at any given time. And I know you would kind of ask like day to day. It
Yeah.
sort of switched between whether the problem was anorexia, whether the problem was bulimia, whether the problem was alcohol and drugs. But I feel like honestly, from 14 to 29, it was like one of
Mhm.
those most of the time. And I did well. Like I played a lot of sports. I got mostly all A's in school. So like those things were happening. But like
Mhm.
whenever my brain was not like actively involved in doing one of those things, I was either like obsessing about my weight or drunk.
Yeah, and see that, and that was the interesting thing that caught my attention was that I don't know if it was I read it or I saw it in one of your videos, but it was this idea of being very still like a stellar student and still doing athletic stuff and so on, and even your accomplishments afterwards. It sounded like you were functioning well on a day to day that almost no one would have noticed in a sense. But
Yeah.
who was noticing? Like who was the one that was telling, "Hey, you need to stop"? Was there anyone?
Yeah. Very few people, which is interesting. Like my mom, sorry, my phone started ringing because my brother's allowed to ring through when it's on Do Not Disturb. So my mom noticed, especially, I feel like she noticed a lot around like the anorexia stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and then I had like a friend in high school who noticed, who kind of tried to stage her own little intervention. She left and went to boarding school and basically told me like, I'm not going to stay here and watch you die because she really knew how much I was drinking and how weird I was about food
Mhm.
at that point. Um, but like mostly my parents didn't know. It's actually been really interesting. I just gave my dad and my stepmom copies of my book, and they have been sort of like less involved in a lot of my recovery stuff. My mom, even though she doesn't believe in God, is actually my editor and reads everything that I write.
Mhm.
So she like knows the stories, so she's had time to process it. But I thought I was giving my dad and my stepmom this like gift of like, oh, look at my book came out. You guys should read it.
Mhm.
But the book starts with a memoir. And they've both actually emailed me since I gave it to them and were like, I'm so sorry. Like, I didn't know.
Wow.
And I was like, I'm so sorry. I did not consider warning you that that's what was in the book. I like, it was not meant to be like, you know what I mean? It wasn't meant to make them feel bad about their parenting or anything that
Yeah, yeah.
happened. I was like, look, the book came out. And then they were like, oh my God, I didn't know this is what you were going through.
Mm.
And then so no one for a while in some ways, but like the people who are around me in performance settings, I feel like knew like that some coaches kind of knew that things were happening. And then what really started to happen is anyone I ever dated um basically broke up with me because of alcohol or talked to me about it or gave me ultimatums
Really?
or yeah. So I would say in the end it was mostly like boyfriends, but they're so easy to get new ones. Like which
Right.
I say in kind of a funny
Mhm.
way, but kind of a
Mhm.
serious way, is that like as soon as someone breaks up with you because of that, you just convince yourself that they didn't understand you and like meet
Mm.
the next one.
Yeah. So that was the mentality about it is that you don't understand why I'm going through this or why I'm having this. This is my way to maybe self-soothe in a way, or decompress from everything. Or, yeah, is that how it was seen? Kind of like this, I love this more than I love you, so it doesn't really matter. Or like,
I,
what was the thought process?
I feel like they saw it as like this girl's got like problems with alcohol. And I feel like the alcohol was kind of the thing that kept coming up because you can't really like, break up with someone for being anorexic. I mean, you can, but it like feels worse if you're the guy to be
Right.
like, break up with you over your eating disorder. But like alcoholism was like easier to talk to me about maybe
Mm-hmm.
than like, hey, why don't you ever eat foods? Um, so I feel like it was more this conversation where they'd be like, is there anything I can do to help you? Like, why do you black out all the time? It's really hard to date you when you're like, because I mean, I would black out and wake up somewhere else, right? So not like cheating on them blacked out, but not because I wanted to cheat on them, just because I blacked out and didn't know where I ended up. So like a lot of hurt and a lot of stuff in all of these, but I feel like it was always just, I'm like, I don't know why I drink that much. I don't want to drink that much. Like maybe it's because I don't eat and then I drink, right? So then I'm like blaming the eating disorder in it or blaming social anxiety. So it was always like,
Mm-hmm.
I genuinely didn't think that I had a problem with alcohol. I thought I had a lot of other problems and then just couldn't figure out why I blacked out all the time. Um, so I think I didn't really know, but it kind of led to these like cycles. I mean, we're also all so young for the most part. I actually dated an older guy when I was in my mid 20s,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the first person who was like, you're an alcoholic. And I was like, you're just in your 40s.
Right.
No, I
Didn't
uh,
understand. Yeah.
didn't really understand. I just thought he was old.
Yeah. No, that's yeah, it's wild. So from 14 to 29, that was kind of like the life.
Yeah.
And and for you it felt like, well, it's just I'm not being understood for what I'm going through, what I'm experiencing. So I'm curious. So at 29, what shifted? Because I think from what you mentioned leading up to 29, there's still no belief in God. Is that right? No strong
Yeah.
belief. So so living that life. So what changed?
Yeah. I would say, if anything, my early 20s, I really was like deterministic. I had a professor in graduate school who was like a biological determinism guy. And I went from sort of like, I'm not really sure, to like, life is biological, like determinism. Like, it doesn't matter what decision I make, it's all biological. In the Big Bang, it was determined like what I'm going to eat for lunch today. Like, I went that far into just like, life is dust, doesn't matter.
Mm,
And then over time, it's so funny how like dependent things were on who I was dating or looking up to, right? So this professor, and then I dated a guy in my like mid 20s to late 20s who maybe was setting me up for the eventual conversion, but he was really new age spiritual. At
mhm,
least put me in this place of like starting to believe that there was something other than the things that I was experiencing um, happening, I guess would probably be the best way to explain it. Um, he was high all the time, which I think like led to some of the like, this is what it's
mhm.
more here. But he also was pretty nice about my drinking because he was high all the time. So that's why that boyfriend lasted so long. But so I think like during my later 20s, I became a little bit more open to like universe stuff. And then unfortunately, that led to like a lot of getting really led astray into like psychics and crystals and all sorts of things that I've actually had to like pray about being released from now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but at least in a weird way, like it was an interesting part of the path because I think it would have been really hard to jump from like determinism to Christianity. But because these like small doors were already opened by these other things, I like
Yeah.
did strongly believe in like, oh gosh, what is that? Like The Secret or like manifestation or like these other things like existing. Um, that are all just like completely self-centered versions of spirituality. Now I've come to understand, but I didn't know that then. And at least they were opening the door toward things.
Hmm.
So that was like my mid to late 20s. And then I hit rock bottom drinking wise. And it's so funny because like nothing happened. People are always like, what is rock bottom? And I'm like, I don't know. The day that I woke up and was like, it's stupid to be alive,
It was just
right?
an aha moment.
Yeah. And it was like several months of spiraling. And I'd gotten to a point where it was very clear that my drinking was not just over partying anymore. I was like drinking box wine 24 hours a day in my studio apartment by myself
Mm.
during COVID. So
Yeah, sure that didn't help.
it's, there's no like excuse that of anything anymore, right? I'm just doing this to myself alone. And eventually just got to a point where I think I was just like, I don't even understand the point of life. Like, what is even the point of living? What's even the point of sobering up? What's even the point of anything? But I think that at least allowed me to realize like I'm spiraling and I need help. Like if I think there's not even a point of being alive anymore, then like something, then I need to do something. And I feel like that something was just like, I somehow need to not be drunk all the time anymore.
Hmm.
Um, and so that propelled me into asking for help, like with that, which sent me into people recommending recovery meetings. And then it was when I got my butt planted in recovery meetings that people said, you need a higher power. And I was like, I got one. It's the universe. Everything's fine.
Hmm.
Um, and then my life got worse and worse and worse because now I'm not drinking and I don't have a relationship with God. I have a relationship with nothing. I've made up a God, and which is really just yourself. If you make up who God is and make it your own, you're actually just worshiping yourself,
Yeah.
and things get worse, which is what happened. So things spiraled more for 6 months while I sat in that, and then it was January of 2021, about 20 days before my 30th birthday, that I finally surrendered to like got brought to a church. There's a whole story there, but ended up in a church on my knees, like looking at a cross. It was like, fine, whatever, like
Mm.
I'll try it. And then that's where the whole story sort of shifts, is beginning from January 4th, 2021, which I did not know that day was going to be my sobriety date.
Hmm.
But that is, so those whole 6 months where I'm trying to do the universe and all this other stuff, I also like kept relapsing, not again on alcohol, but I was like cocaine and mushrooms and like
Mm.
LSD because I need to have a spiritual experience and like just spiraling in that sense. So January 4th was when I got on my knees in a church and was like, okay, like if you're real, do something. And then one day at a time, that has remained my sobriety date for more than 4 years now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's amazing. I mean, it's great um, to be able to reach that point. I'm sure it was a huge relief afterwards. And then obviously the recovery process is another stage in and of
Yeah.
itself. But as the listeners are hearing this, one of the things that I keep thinking about, Lisa, as you were sharing, is just how far deep it can go into these addictions.
Mhm.
And if you're watching all of this from that 14 to 29 years of age that you were experiencing, anyone from the outside is like, there's no hope for that person. They're just going to
Mhm.
be like this for the rest of their lives. So to hear from you sharing all of that and then getting to the point where I don't even know what this is, I'm just going
Mhm.
to give it a try and see what happens. And gosh, it just speaks to the power of God in those very deep, dark moments. And I can't even imagine what your nights were when you had to process everything that had happened in the last 15 years prior to that. Can you give us a glimpse of what those nights were like for you? I feel like people most often reflect on their changed night, but I don't know. What was that like for you?
Yeah. Well, even as you were talking, it was making me think that I think one of the coolest things about a relationship with God that I've like come to, I don't know, have developed whatever over the last 4 years, um, is that like, yes, I've been sober since that day. Like, great. I have not used mind altering chemicals other than like Advil and coffee since that day. Um, However, I think what's almost cooler, which sounds crazy to be like, you were drunk 24 hours a day and now you're not. Like, that's pretty darn cool. That says a lot about God. However, I think what's cooler than that is like all of the other changes. And those changes might actually be more relevant to the average listener who like may not be drinking themselves to death right now, but just like is still having like anxiety from day to day, is still like wondering their
Mm,
purpose in life, is still like worried what other people are thinking about them, is still worried about the health of their friends and family, is still like wanting certain goals or certain things. And like, how do I manage like my goals and like my expectations and my purpose? And like all of those things have like begun to sort themselves out over the last 4 years also. And
mhm,
like, those things are a lot of the reason why I was drinking, right? In a bunch of anger.
mm,
But I feel like that's been one of the coolest things is like to watch those things sort themselves out, but to go back to like what it's like when you first start processing those things. Like for me, the first couple of years really of sobriety was like these highs where I'm like, I'm forgiving people and God's helping me and this is the coolest thing ever and I can't believe I don't hate this person anymore and they don't pop into my head and this is amazing. And then just like being exhausted and wondering if I'm depressed again and like
Mm.
just like I feel like the highs and lows of that because there's so much being processed and like
Yeah.
so many little mini awakenings happening that it's like it's almost like you get a mini awakening and then it all needs to like process through and then like so it just was such a mix of like I don't think that I ever felt that's actually not true. I was gonna say I don't think I ever felt like deep despair, but there was a couple times, especially like
Mm.
still have a menstrual cycle, man. And there are like certain types of the month, especially times in the month early on, where like the hormones and like the healing cycle hit just right. And I would go back to being like, this not even real. Like, why is this
Right.
happening? And then like 2 days later, I'm like, okay, I like get it. And I'm like feeling better about this thing. But it was not linear. Like it's not like
It's not. Yeah.
January 4th and then everything has been like everything has actually been uphill since then, but
Mhm.
that like hill looked much more
Yeah.
like that than just like climbing straight up. Because I fought back about a lot of things. Like there's been certain times in my recovery and my relationship with God, like if we just go all the way full circle to talking about forgiveness in the beginning,
Hmm.
January 5th, I did not believe, right? It's been one day, I'm a Christian one day. I did not believe in unconditional forgiveness. I did not think that I needed to forgive everyone who harmed me. I didn't think they deserved it. I was glad that hell existed and they were probably going there. Like that is
Mm.
not the type of person that I am today. But that's the thing is that there's like salvation. Great. Now I like believed in Jesus, but then there's just like, I think till I die, right? There will be more and
Yeah.
more sanctification of these like layers being revealed to me of places. And on January 5th, 2021, like
Mm.
now they're like a little bit more subtle, I think, the things God's working on. They were harsh things God was working on. I mean, I don't even really talk about this in podcasts that much, but like
Mm.
I had just like the summer before gotten into Seeking Arrangements, which is essentially this like prostitution website. And I was like
Mm.
not even totally convinced that I needed to give that up on January 5th. So
Mm.
like my sanctification journey has been long, right?
Yeah.
To be like, Jesus, I believe in you. And then on January 5th, be like, you're sure I can't trade money for sex? And they're like, no, you really can't do that anymore.
Right.
That's not the thing. So like
Mm.
no matter where you are in that journey, like that to the point where today I'm like, I'm really trying to like stop swearing or like stop like lying's gone, but like little ways that I lie to myself or like
Mm.
being too controlling of my husband or like am I in sloths when I'm not picking up after myself? Like that's where I live today. But day one was not like that, right? Day one was like big chunky sins that I was
Yeah.
still very much in.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that because I think from those who grow up in the church, it's hard for us to see that, or it's kind of like the story that we always wanted, right? The idea of seeing someone in the deepest, darkest pit of their life. Jesus comes in, saves the day, and now they have this, this uphill, like everything's uphill after that, because how much farther can you go when you've been to the deepest, darkest pit? So for those who grew up in the church, they often think to themselves, they see their testimony as something like, it's not as uh, dramatic or as spectacular as someone else who was saved from that place where you were
Mm,
at. So they don't often appreciate their own growth, which is slow, but also there's these very deep falls in their Christian walks, kind of like a
mhm,
David moment, right? Someone who sought after God, but then had these really horrific sins, and then they obviously he gets reestablished by God. So I think those who grew up in the church see that story and think that it's only uphill. So when you
mhm.
share that, no, there was still some things they had to wrestle with, but at least it was still going up. That relationship was growing with God. So I appreciate you sharing that because I do know that a lot of Christians who grew up in the church want to have a type of testimony that kind of has like that punch when they share with other people. But I think what I encourage them to do is no, share your story because that's part of it too. Is like even as a Christian, that doesn't mean that your life is easy, right? Every Christian faces trial and tribulations, and they're different. And God's given to one what maybe others couldn't do, and so on. So yeah, I'm thankful that you shared that.
It's
Um,
interesting. I just want to like touch on what you said.
mhm.
It's not that I don't appreciate other people who have stories like me, but it's so funny if you're listening and you're like, I don't have an important testimony. Most of the people that I listen to, like if I think of like the Christians who I regularly listen to them on podcasts or whatever,
Mhm.
they are people who grew up in the church, right?
Mm,
I'm not like seeking out people with like bang up testimony. Like it's fine if they do. I'm not like purposely not seeking out people with crazy
mhm,
testimonies. But for me, it's actually really cool to hear people who it's like, because there can also be this perception who it's, I guess who I was going to say, like, who it's like they believed in God their entire life and they've just been like, how have they worked through these different stages of things? How have they fallen into different things and pulled themselves back out?
mm,
Um, because I feel like that's more it's not interesting. And this sounds horrible. It's not interesting to me that someone didn't used to believe in God and now they do. I'm like, okay, but now that you do, like, how do
mm,
you wrestle with these different like things? So I just want to encourage anyone who has believed in God the whole time that those are the teachers that I really like listening to because it's hearing how they like work through things, interface with God when they doubt their faith, because I can have this perception too that it's like from January 4th on, I'm never supposed to doubt the power of God and everything is fine. And like,
mm.
would that be ideal? Yes. But is that how my day-to-day life has been lived?
Right.
Not always. So it's helpful to hear that it's not just because I'm new to faith, it's that like that happens to
Mm.
everyone in faith.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great point. I think you'll appreciate this. There's this research done on attachment theory, and one is called correspondence theory, and one is called the compensation theory. Correspondence theory is those who grew up in the church, whatever their parents modeled for them, they tend to attribute those same characteristics to God. So if their parents were harsh, critical, judgmental, they grow up believing that God is harsh, critical, judgmental. So they'll read those passages in scripture and say, look, see here, God is just, so I have to make sure I'm on the straight and narrow, and so on, right? And then they themselves can also become very judgmental. But if their parents were loving, caring, kind, gentle, then they read scripture through that lens and see God as kind, caring, and gentle. So it corresponds with the way that their parents treat them. Um,
Interesting.
the compensation theory is usually people who do not grow up in the church, so they go live their life, and then they start when they do receive the Lord, come into contact with the church. Now God compensates for everything that they feel that they lacked in their childhood. So you see God as kind of the savior of everything they needed: security, comfort, love, patience, kindness, all of these things that I didn't get as a child. Now in my relationship with God, I'm seeing it and I'm experiencing it for the first time. And so for them, they feel it compensates for everything that they lacked in their childhood. So I love hearing these stories where we're seeing these characteristics because it does teach us a lot about how we relate to God. You know,
Mhm.
you shared in your story that there was a time where you also became an atheist. And I'm curious, was that during the New Age spirituality? Was it after you came to the Lord? Where was that piece at? Unless I'm
That No, no, no. That was more, I feel like early graduate school, a couple of years. I just like kind of talked about it as like biological determinism.
oh, okay,
But
gotcha.
that was essentially like the few years where I was just like, there is nothing beyond what I can see. Like I can see it all. This is all that there is. And
Mm,
so I don't know if it was like, it wasn't as though I was like out there being like, I am an antichrist. Like this is what it is. But I mean, if you're not for him, you're against him. So in some ways, I guess I was by default
yeah.
an antichrist. But I was just convinced that like this was all just biological and that was it.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense too. Um, so now that you're in the Lord and have, remained sober, still have some struggles here and there, what is something that you've been able to, what is the biggest takeaway, I guess, from your relationship with the Lord? How has he spoken to you recently and even through your book?
Yeah. Um, I think so many ways. I feel like recently, um, one of the biggest lessons that I've been learning is just that like I don't get to plan.
Mm,
Like I don't get to know what's next. I just get to like have faith in that. And I feel like that's been like like with the book coming out and all this stuff, I was like, okay, I'm an author now. I like need to start writing on Substack, which I did in October. I'm like gonna focus more on Instagram. I'm like all of this stuff. And then like there's a whole story about how it happened, but like God was like, no, you're actually gonna take a full-time job. And I was like,
Right.
what? The book just came out. And he's like, no, this is like what it is. And there was just some like crazy signs. Like I'm a big, like God has spoken to me through like people, obviously, but just through like that, that thing where you like see something and someone else can talk you out of it because they're like, well, that happens a million times. But like you see it and it just has that like ping in your heart where you're like,
Hmm.
oh, that's God talking to me right now. There was just like so many things that I could not deny that this is where God wants me for the moment. But I feel like what's so cool about God is that like when I try to calculate things, which I love to calculate things, right? I was in school for so long. Like I can calculate how much time is in the day. And if you give me a full-time job, I'm not going to be able to do all the things that I'm supposed to be doing for you and your kingdom. Like
Mm.
if I have to do this. And he's like, you're going to be fine. Like, watch this. And what happened is just like a bunch of things. I had filled my day with a bunch of things that I didn't need to be doing, and a bunch of these things that were actually just sort of like, I don't want to say waste of time because some of them were useful, but like I didn't need to be doing anyway, fell away. Um, and like I still have time. Like I have not changed the cadence at which I post. I still write an essay every week that goes up on Saturday. I just
Mm.
like also have a job during the daytime now. And so it's been really cool to just watch that happen and even allow people to step into roles that they haven't before. Like for the last couple of years, I've taught this recovery workshop with my husband on Tuesday nights, and
Mhm.
it starts at 5. And I need to be working. I mean, it's remote, but I need to be working till 5, and it's like 20 minutes away. So I cannot do that workshop.
Mm.
But it allowed me to be like, hey, what if Amanda does it with you, right? Which is a woman who goes to our home group who's been like progressing in her faith. And like
Mm.
now Kevin, my husband, does it with Amanda and it's going so well. So it's just
Mm.
also like to give other people places where I didn't even know that they like had God's trying to, use their
Provide.
gifts over there and he can use my gifts over here. And I don't need to be in all of the places at once. Um,
Mm.
so it's even been cool to see things where it's like, but I have to do that workshop. And it's like, no, the workshop has to get done because it helps
Mhm.
a lot of people. But am I the person who has to do that? No.
Mm. And that's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so hard when we're seeing our gifts to be able to be used in a specific area and God needing us in maybe a different area from that
Yeah.
to
But
develop
yeah,
other gifts probably.
yeah. And it's just been cool to see like how, like literally not only did I start a full-time job, but I've been going to this new church, like a church, they
Mm.
just had week 3 last week, in Minneapolis. Um, and so they have like no teams, right? Like no one's serving. They're just trying to figure things out.
Mm.
So I like joined their communications team and I said that I would write the emails that they send out, which is like a recap of Sunday and an invitation email. And it's like, I'm going to add running all the emails for this brand new church. I'm going to add full-time job. And God's like, yeah, it's going to be fine. Just like do
Mhm.
it. So,
Mhm.
and it has been. And I think that's probably been my biggest lesson as of late. There's been different lessons, obviously, tons of
Yeah.
them over the last 4 years. But I think that's been my biggest lesson as of late. And I think it's cool, like again, going back to that, like if you just let God keep progressing you, like for me for the last 4 years, or whether it's for over 30 years for some of your listeners, you know what I mean? Like if they've just been a Christian since they were 5, um, that like there keeps being these new layers of lessons because it's like when I first started, that lesson of like, hey, you actually have to forgive everyone was like massive. And then this lesson of like holding hate in your heart for others was massive. This lesson
Mm.
of like, you need to take responsibility for your actions in causing the situations in your life, right? Was
Mm.
massive. But it's like, I get those now. The second that I feel disturbed about something, I'm like, what did I do to cause this? Because I know that I did something. And so
Yep.
like now that those things are automatic, it's like these more subtle things that I
Hmm.
learn, like, hey, maybe stop thinking that you're the one who runs the show, Lisa, and realize that God is the one who runs the show.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a different approach to life when we're able to kind of really take a step back and reflect on how we are in any given situation. Basically, when the Bible talks, I think it's in James, when it talks about the mirror, how we forget very easily what we see in the mirror when we leave it. And yeah, that idea we forget kind of our influence in different situations, our impact in different situations, or our responsibilities in different situations. That's why we have the Word of God. It kind of reflects back to us like, hey, we're sinners too, not just all the other people around us.
Yeah. There's this one line I should know because I like read it all the time. I have it literally just a physical bookmark and a physical Bible that is over there. But when I was applying for this job, I know they say don't always do Bible roulette where you just like open the Bible and are like, what do you have for me today? I know there's
Mhm.
problems with that, but that's what I was doing. And so I was doing that, and there's this like line, I don't even know what book it's in, which is sad. But it's basically, I think it might be Deuteronomy somewhere, but it's just like God knows better. It's like God basically like stop trying to create your own wisdom. Like the best wisdom of all comes from above.
Mm.
Um, and that's been like big for me just in I think like work projects and try like the life plans I was talking about, or even we just like recently moved into this house and when we were house shopping, it's like stop thinking that me obsessively spending more time doing something is going to get me closer to the right answer. I
Mm.
just like pray about it and listen and follow the steps that God is pointing me toward. Um, and that otherwise I'm just spinning my wheels and wasting time.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's really good. Um, Gosh, I feel like we've covered so much, Lisa. I'm curious, is there, before we close today, is there anything that I missed? Anything that you feel like, you know what? I mean, as we were talking about this, I think this would be really good for your audience to take away from this conversation, kind of like a takeaway message, or just maybe something that I didn't cover.
Um, I feel like maybe just circling back a little bit on the like various mental health stuff,
Yeah.
because I know people struggle with that like in various ways and at all different levels. Like you may have
Mm.
people who are like having debilitating anxiety, like I had on here, or you may have people who are just like, hey, I get nervous a lot, or like before I go to social settings, I get nervous, or before public speaking, I get nervous. It's not taking over my life, but I still like
Mm.
there's stuff here. Or like depression, right? There's like, I can't get out of bed for 2 weeks, which is I've suffered from. And then there's also just like, I need an extra nap because I just like am fatigued. And then there's just
Mm.
like, I'm sad and I don't know what, right? There's all different levels of these things. So I'm not just speaking toward people who like have a clinical diagnosis.
That's good.
Um, in the eating disorder too, right? It's like there's people who are starving themselves to death and vomiting up their food all the time, like I was. And there's people who are just like, you're a little weird about food and you're like afraid of butter or afraid of gluten, right? And there's just like
Mm.
little stuff going on with food. And what I found is that like really slowing down and examining myself has brought so much healing
Mm.
like across that spectrum because kind of I've had that experience like whatever I call it chunky sin or something, but like the chunky mental health, like
Mm.
God helped me with a lot of that in the beginning, but now I don't suffer from that anymore. And I suffer from more of like the second half of all of those spectrums I was talking about, if I'm
Mhm.
going to suffer at all. And every time there's always something spiritual going on with me
Mm.
underneath it. And it's like, if I can just slow down and be honest with myself, compassionate with myself, right? Because God would want us to be compassionate with ourselves, compassionate with myself, but honest with myself about what's really going on. Like if I'm having a day where I'm just like really tired and like sad and I don't know why, to look at like, who am I angry at? Or like, what have I
Mhm.
been trying to control? Or like, what am I not giving to God? That
Mm.
like things for me are not, my most recent essay was Despair is Not Biological, was the title of it, which is a little bit snippety. Um,
Mhm.
but what I was trying to like really get at is that like my experience of whether it's despair, anxiety, eating disorders, alcoholism, whatever it is that like it doesn't mean that the chemicals in my brain don't eventually get affected, but that's not like ground zero. Ground zero is what's going on with me spiritually. And then brain
Mm.
chemicals manifest, behaviors manifest, all these other things manifest. But like, what is going on underneath that? And when I can be super honest with myself, I watched a lot of that stuff like go away, because what's really happening is I'm getting like stuck in my own sin, and sometimes it's super minor stuff that I really just don't feel like admitting to. Like a funny
Mm,
example is like leaving. My husband and I go to the Minnesota Wild a lot, the NHL hockey team.
mhm,
Um, and I was just like tired and I didn't want to be there. So I'm like, being just having feelings that are not feelings of happiness. And we're leaving and we get in the car and he's like, wants to show me some like video on his phone. And then I'm like, can we just go home? Like
mm.
in that tone.
Yeah, so-
Um, and he just like looked over and was like, I'd prefer it if you didn't tell me what to do. And I literally gets like so mad, right? And so like that's kind of the moments I'm talking about is like
Mm,
I was so upset in that moment. If I did not pause and self-examine, which I'll explain how I did that in a second,
mm,
I would be anxious that night. I would be
mm,
depressed the next day. I would maybe even get weird about food again if I let it go on for so long. So like those things for me, like those different mental health symptoms manifest from just like the tiniest little things that I let fester. So like in that moment, because of me, I let myself be mad for like 10 seconds. I'm like, this freaking guy, um,
mhm.
my loving husband. And then right. And then I sat there and I was like, okay, I'm mad at him right now because he called me a control freak, which he didn't actually do, but that's what he did in my head.
Mm,
Um, and then it's like, then for a second I sit there and then I'm like, I was being controlling. And
mm,
like even further back than that, I was like resentful that the game was going on for too long, right? So, and it's just silly things, but it's like if I can just look at that and be like, I was being self-centered, I was being resentful, and then I was being controlling, and
mm,
like that's okay. And when I can just go to God and be like, hey, I was struggling tonight with resentment, with selfishness, and with being controlling of my husband. Like, please help me with those. Take them away and be helpful. Then it's like funny, right? Like then I like started laughing in the car and he was like, what? And I was like, well, you call me a control freak and I was annoyed at you for doing that. And then I realized that I was being one. And
right.
then you can have this like funny interface and it
Yeah.
actually also like so like the relationship is better and like the spiritual part of just being like, I need to confess that I was being a brat.
Mm,
Um,
mhm.
and that doesn't make me like it doesn't sink me into shame. It actually does the other thing, which is like heals those things by just being able to confess them to God and another person.
Yeah. I mean, that was, I think this is the piece that a lot of people miss when they go to counseling, right? So there's this belief, and I'm going to talk about this at some point on my IG page, this myth of if you go to counseling, you're going to heal or you're healing. But really, it's the work that you do outside of it, right? Because there's
Mhm.
people who continue to go to counseling sometimes and there's no change because they think the going to counseling itself is what's causing some change or just better understanding, but only in session. But what you just explained is here's what it looks like when I experience it. I pause, I reflect, I challenge, I confront what's my responsibility, how did I respond, and being, to your point, being honest with myself about what this interaction was like. And then that's what continues to bring the healing. But I think what if there's any common thread that I've seen is those who go to counseling but then don't do the work, they continue to struggle with that piece of being honest with themselves. So I really like how you kind of paused and walked us through what that looks like for you, because I think people miss that. It's like, what does this look like on a day to day? Exactly like that. It's good.
Yeah. And it can be so minor. So many people would just be like, oh, whatever, just brush that under the rug. And it's like,
Right,
we
exactly.
would have been like silent the whole car ride home, and then everyone would have been like in their own little like thing,
Yep.
and then it gets worse.
And everything builds up and then the next one builds up and then you have these eruptions, right? Where I could have dealt with this when it was small. Now that it's big, it becomes a huge issue. But yeah, no, that was really good. And thank you for bringing us back to that. There is so much to say on mental health, and maybe that could be a conversation for another time. But Lisa, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate you sharing your story. And can you tell us just a little bit about your book? I know we've talked about it here and there throughout our conversation, but yeah, I'm going to post that on the show notes. But yeah, what could the audience look forward to if they were to buy your book?
Yeah, so it's called 52 Life-Changing Lessons I Learned in Recovery.
Mm,
And it's basically 52 lessons that are not dissimilar from some of the ones that we talked about today. So it's basically, if you think of just like the mini lessons that were in there, like about forgiveness or about whatever, it's 52 of those.
Mm.
Some of them are about coming to believe. Some of them are a little bit like addiction specific.
Mm.
What is a craving to me spiritually, or what is alcoholism? What is an eating disorder? But then the whole second half of the book is basically like relatable to anyone. So yeah,
Good.
that's what that's about. I was
On
trying
Amazon? Can you get it
wanted to-
anywhere?
It's on Amazon. DM me if you can't find it. Just DM me, and I will find a way to get you a copy.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, I appreciate you being on the show, and thank you so much. And hopefully we can do another one sometime.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.